On a humid evening in late summer, 48 years after the birth of Christ, a palace slave named Thrasus stood trembling in the servants' corridor of the imperial palace on Rome's Palatine Hill, staring at a sealed wooden tablet that had just been pressed into his hands by a eunuch he'd never seen before. The tablet bore no markings, no indication of who had sent it or what it contained. But the eunuch had whispered 3 words before disappearing back into the labyrinth of palace passages. The Empress summons. Thrasus felt his stomach turn to ice. He was 19 years old, Greek by birth, sold into slavery at 14 after his father's bankruptcy, purchased by an imperial purchasing agent 3 years ago for his literacy and his discretion. In his time serving the imperial household, he had learned the first rule of palace survival: avoid the attention of powerful people. Powerful people were dangerous. Their whims could elevate a slave to a position of comfort and privilege, or could end a slave's life on a moment's notice. And no one in the palace was more dangerous than the Empress Valeria Messalina. Thrasus had never spoken directly to the Empress. He had seen her, of course. Everyone in the palace had seen her, moving through the corridors with an entourage of attendants, beautiful in a way that seemed almost aggressive, her auburn hair elaborately styled, her clothing always the finest silk, her jewelry catching the light as she walked. But he had been careful never to be noticed by her, never to be in a position where she might actually see him as an individual rather than as part of the anonymous mass of palace servants. Now she had summoned him, specifically, by name. And Thrasus understood with the clarity that comes from pure terror that his life had just become very complicated and very dangerous. He broke the seal on the tablet with shaking hands. The message inside was brief. Come to the private chambers. Sunset. Tell no one. Wear your plainest clothing, P. The signature was a single letter, but Thrasus knew who P was. Everyone in the palace knew about Phoebe, the Greek freedwoman who served as Messalina's personal attendant and who was widely rumored to manage the Empress's most delicate arrangements. Arrangements that, according to palace gossip, whispered in corners and never spoken aloud in public spaces, involved matters that would destroy anyone if they became widely known. As the sun began to set, painting the Roman sky in shades of orange and purple, Thrasus made his way to the section of the palace where the imperial family's private chambers were located. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Why would the Empress summon him? What could she possibly want with a junior slave who worked in the administrative offices copying correspondence? Had he done something wrong, violated some rule he didn't know existed? Was he about to be accused of theft or incompetence? Would he be beaten, sold to a worse master, executed? When he reached the designated doorway, he found Phoebe waiting. She was a woman of perhaps 35, attractive in a severe way, dressed in expensive clothing that marked her elevated status as the Empress's personal attendant. She looked Thrasus up and down with eyes that seemed to catalog and assess every detail, then smiled. A smile that did nothing to ease his fear, because it suggested she found his nervousness amusing. "You're Thrasus," she said. Not a question, a statement. "You read and write Greek and Latin. You've been with the household for 3 years. You're literate, discreet, and intelligent enough to follow complex instructions. The Empress has a task for you tonight." Thrasus managed to nod, his mouth too dry to speak. Phoebe's smile widened slightly. "You will accompany her into the city. You will wear civilian clothes. I have garments for you here. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not reveal her identity to anyone you encounter under any circumstances. You will observe everything that happens, but you will discuss nothing you witness with anyone, ever, for any reason. Do you understand what happens to slaves who fail to keep the Empress's secrets?" Thrasus nodded again. He understood perfectly. Slaves who betrayed imperial confidences disappeared. Sometimes their bodies were found floating in the Tiber. Sometimes they simply vanished and were never mentioned again, as though they had never existed. "Good," Phoebe said. She handed him a bundle of clothing, a simple tunic, a common cloak, sandals that had seen better days. "Change into these. Wait here. The Empress will come shortly." Thrasus changed quickly, his fingers fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings. The clothing was deliberately shabby, the kind worn by freedmen or poor citizens, completely unlike the neat slave tunic he normally wore in the palace. When he was dressed, Phoebe inspected him critically, adjusted his cloak, and nodded with satisfaction. "You look sufficiently ordinary. Now remember, whatever you see tonight, your life depends on your discretion." They waited in silence for perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like hours to Thrasus. Then he heard footsteps, and 2 women entered the corridor. One was Phoebe's counterpart, another of Messalina's attendants. The other, dressed in a plain stola with a common cloak over it, and her distinctive auburn hair completely covered by a dark hood, was unmistakably the Empress. Even in common clothing, there was something about Messalina that marked her as extraordinary. Perhaps it was the way she moved, with complete confidence and a kind of predatory grace. Perhaps it was her face, beautiful even without the elaborate cosmetics she wore in public, her features sharp and intelligent, her eyes gleaming with what Thrasus would later recognize as excitement. She looked at Thrasus briefly, assessing him the same way Phoebe had, then nodded. "He'll do," she said. Her voice was cultured, educated, the accent marking her as aristocratic despite the common clothing. "Let's go. I want to be there before full dark." And so, Thrasus found himself walking through the darkening streets of Rome, following 2 steps behind the Empress of Rome and her attendant Phoebe, moving steadily away from the Palatine Hill where the wealthy and powerful lived, down into the valleys where the common people made their homes. They moved through the Forum, busy even at this hour, with merchants closing their shops and citizens conducting last-minute business. They passed temples and public buildings where Thrasus had never been. They entered neighborhoods he had never visited, areas where the apartment buildings, the insulae, rose 4 and 5 stories high, where the streets narrowed and became crowded, where the smell of cooking food and human waste and incense from household shrines mixed into the distinctive odor of urban poverty. They were heading, Thrasus realized with growing unease, into the Suburra. The Suburra was Rome's most notorious district, a dense warren of narrow streets and tall buildings where the working poor lived in cramped conditions, where crime was rampant, where women sold companionship openly and brazenly, where taverns and gambling dens and worse places operated freely. Respectable people did not go to the Suburra after dark. Women of good family did not go to the Suburra at all, and the Empress of Rome certainly did not go to the Suburra, except she did. Messalina seemed to know exactly where she was going, moving through the twisting streets with confidence, occasionally glancing at street corners or landmarks to orient herself, but never showing any hesitation or uncertainty. She had been here before, Thrasus realized. Multiple times, probably. This was not a desperate flight or a dangerous adventure. This was a routine that Messalina had established, a pattern she followed regularly. They reached their destination after perhaps 30 minutes of walking, a building that looked like any other in the Suburra, unremarkable except for a red lantern hanging beside the door. The red lantern was a universal signal in Rome, marking a building as a house of ill repute, a place where women sold companionship and where men came to purchase private entertainment. Thrasus felt his fear spike into something approaching panic. Why was the Empress of Rome bringing him to such an establishment? Phoebe knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 2 knocks, pause. 3 knocks, pause. 1 knock. The door opened immediately, revealing a large man with the scarred face of someone who had worked as an enforcer or guard. He looked at Phoebe, then at Messalina, and his expression shifted from professional wariness to something like recognition mixed with fear. He stepped aside without a word, gesturing them inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit by oil lamps, the light flickering and creating moving shadows on the walls. The main room held benches and cushions where clients could wait or negotiate with the women who worked there. Several women were present, dressed in short tunics that exposed their legs and arms, their faces painted with cosmetics, their hair styled in ways meant to attract male attention. They looked up when the door opened, assessed the newcomers, and returned to their conversations, except for one older woman who rose and approached immediately. This woman was perhaps 50, heavy-set, her face showing the remnants of beauty now faded, her clothing more expensive than the working women wore. She was clearly the owner or manager of the establishment. She bowed slightly to Messalina, not the deep bow she would give to a recognized Empress, but a gesture of respect that suggested she knew who her visitor was and understood the need for discretion. "My lady," the woman said quietly, "your usual room is prepared. Will you require—" she glanced at Thrasus, "the full arrangements?" Messalina nodded. "The full arrangements. I'll be here until dawn." She looked at Thrasus directly for the first time since leaving the palace, and her eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. Amusement? Excitement? Challenge? This one is just an observer tonight. He's here to learn what discretion means. Position him where he can see but won't interfere. The establishment's keeper nodded and gestured to a corner of the room where a small stool stood partially obscured by a column. "There," she said to Thrasus. "Sit there. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't interfere no matter what you see. Understood?" Thrasus, Saturday, he understood nothing, but he understood that he had no choice but to obey. What Thrasus witnessed over the next 6 hours would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because of the shock value alone, though that was considerable, not because of the degradation involved, though that was profound, but because of what it revealed about the woman who ruled Rome from behind her husband's throne, about the psychology of power corrupted absolutely, about how someone given everything could still need more, could still crave transgression for transgression's sake, could still seek out experiences that destroyed every boundary and violated every social norm just to feel something that unlimited privilege could no longer provide through conventional means. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that house, before I reveal what the Empress of Rome did there and why this single anecdote became central to her historical reputation, I need to take you back. I need to tell you who Messalina was, how she rose to power, what she did with that power, and why her name has become synonymous with depravity and corruption for 2,000 years. Because understanding what happened in that establishment, and understanding whether it actually happened as described, or whether it's symbolic truth rather than literal truth, requires understanding the whole arc of Messalina's extraordinary and appalling life. And I promise you, by the time we return to that house in the Suburra, and to Thrasus sitting frozen on his stool watching something he could never have imagined, you will understand why ancient historians struggled to find adequate words to describe Messalina's behavior. You will understand why Roman poets made her the ultimate symbol of female corruption. You will understand why her story has been told and retold for 2 millennia as the definitive cautionary tale about power without restraint. If you want to understand how systematic corruption functions, how intimate relations can be weaponized for political control, how someone can use intelligence and beauty and position to destroy lives while pursuing their own pleasure, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn goes beyond simple scandal into territory that reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you know about Imperial Rome, because I guarantee this story will shock you even if you think you know Roman history. And make sure you watch all the way to the end, because I'm going to tell you about the scandal that finally destroyed Messalina, an act so audacious and so insane that even by Roman standards it seemed impossible, an act that led directly to her death, and that still seems almost unbelievable, even with all the historical evidence supporting it. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the girl who would become history's most scandalous empress. Valeria Messalina was born around the year 20 after the birth of Christ, in Rome, into a family that represented the absolute apex of Roman society. Her family tree read like a catalogue of imperial power. She was directly descended from Augustus's sister, Octavia. She was connected through multiple lines to the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus transformed it from a republic into an empire. Her relatives included emperors, consuls, generals, some of the most distinguished and powerful people in the Roman world. To be born Valeria Messalina was to be born into a world where power was your birthright, where the highest positions in society were occupied by your relatives, where you grew up understanding that ordinary rules and limitations simply did not apply to people of your status. We know frustratingly little about Messalina's childhood and youth. Ancient historians focused on scandalous adult behavior rather than on developmental psychology, so we don't have detailed accounts of her early years. But we can reconstruct the likely outlines of her life before marriage, based on what we know about how aristocratic girls were raised in Rome during this era. She would have been educated, certainly. Girls of the highest families learned to read and write both Latin and Greek. They studied literature, particularly the great poets like Homer, Virgil, and Ovid. They learned music, especially the lyre, which was considered an appropriate accomplishment for aristocratic women. They studied the domestic arts, weaving, household management, the supervision of slaves. But they also received informal education in the arts of political manipulation simply by growing up in households where political maneuvering was constant, and where survival often depended on understanding who held power and how to navigate relationships with them. She would have been surrounded by luxury that most people in the ancient world could barely imagine. The homes of the Roman aristocracy were palaces, filled with expensive furniture imported from across the empire, decorated with paintings by the finest artists and sculptures by renowned masters, staffed by small armies of slaves who attended to every conceivable need. Messalina grew up wearing silk imported from China, eating delicacies brought from the furthest reaches of the empire, entertained by the best musicians and performers, completely insulated from the hardships that ordinary Romans experienced daily. The meals alone would have been extraordinary. Breakfast might include bread with honey, fresh fruit, cheese, and watered wine. The main meal of the day would feature multiple courses, appetizers of eggs and olives, main courses of roasted meats and fish prepared with exotic spices, vegetables dressed with expensive olive oil, desserts of pastries sweetened with honey and studded with nuts. The wealthy Romans of Messalina's class ate lying on couches, attended by slaves who brought each course and poured wine mixed with water in precisely the proportions preferred by each diner. Her clothing would have been magnificent. Roman aristocratic women wore stolas, long flowing garments made of the finest linen or silk, dyed in expensive colors, particularly the famous Tyrian purple that cost a fortune to produce. They wore jewelry of gold and precious stones, necklaces and bracelets and rings that displayed their family's wealth. Their hair was styled elaborately by skilled slave hairdressers who spent hours creating the complex arrangements that fashion demanded, building structures of curls and braids decorated with pins and combs of precious metal. But she would also have been surrounded by danger and political intrigue. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was characterized by internal feuds, plots, betrayals, murders, disguised as accidents or suicides. Messalina's childhood coincided with the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula, two emperors whose paranoia led to numerous executions and exiles of aristocrats suspected of disloyalty or ambition. She would have heard about relatives and family, friends who fell from favor, who were accused of treason on flimsy evidence, who died or disappeared. She grew up understanding that family connection to the imperial line was both a tremendous privilege and a potential death sentence, that survival required political acumen and the ability to navigate complex and dangerous relationships. Messalina would have learned by observation how power actually worked in imperial Rome. She would have watched as her mother and other aristocratic women managed their households, giving orders to slaves and freedmen, hosting dinner parties where political alliances were formed or broken, using charm and manipulation to influence their husbands and other powerful men. She would have learned that women in her society had limited formal power. They could not vote, could not hold political office, could not command armies, but that they could exercise enormous informal influence through the men in their lives. She would have observed the games of social dominance that characterized aristocratic life, how seating arrangements at dinner parties communicated status, how the quality of gifts exchanged reflected the balance of favor and obligation between families, how marriages were arranged to benefit family interests rather than individual desires, how reputation was everything, and how easily reputation could be destroyed through gossip and scandal. She learned the languages of power, spoken and unspoken, that would serve her when she later needed to navigate the even more treacherous waters of the imperial court. When Messalina was approximately 18 years old, the sources are vague about her exact age, she was married to Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Claudius. The marriage was arranged, as all aristocratic marriages were in Rome, to benefit both families through the alliance. For Messalina's family, the marriage connected them more directly to the immediate imperial family. For Claudius's family, Messalina's impeccable lineage added luster to a branch that had been somewhat marginalized. Claudius was approximately 50 years old at the time of the marriage, nearly 3 decades older than his teenage bride. He was a member of the imperial family, the younger brother of the famous general Germanicus and the uncle of the current emperor Caligula. But no one expected Claudius to ever amount to much politically. Claudius had physical disabilities, a limp, a stutter, a tremor in his hands, a tendency to drool when excited or nervous, that made him seem unsuitable for public life in a culture that valued physical perfection and martial prowess. His own family had marginalized him for most of his life, excluding him from military commands and political offices, treating him as an embarrassment to be hidden away. His mother Antonia had reportedly called him a monster of a man, not finished but merely begun by nature. His grandmother Livia had treated him with contempt. Even Augustus, his great-uncle, had written letters questioning whether Claudius should be allowed to appear in public at family events because his disabilities were so obvious. Claudius had responded to this marginalization by becoming a scholar, writing histories of Carthage and Etruria and the Etruscan language, spending his time in libraries rather than in the forum or on campaign. He was intelligent, educated, kind by most accounts, but he was not seen as someone who would ever wield real power. His scholarship was respected by other scholars, but dismissed by practical politicians as the useless occupation of someone who couldn't handle real responsibilities. So Messalina's marriage to Claudius probably seemed like a safe, comfortable arrangement to her family. She would be married to a harmless scholar who would never demand too much from her, who would give her a respected position as the wife of an imperial family member, without any of the dangers that came with being too close to actual power. She would live in comfort, raise children who would have prestigious lineage from both parents, manage a household, and otherwise live the life of a wealthy aristocratic matron. For an 18-year-old girl being married off to a much older man she barely knew, it could have been far worse. Many aristocratic women were married to brutal men, to political climbers who would use them as pawns, to men who kept mistresses openly and treated their wives with contempt. Claudius, by all accounts, was gentle and scholarly, unlikely to mistreat her. Messalina settled into her role as Claudius's wife. She bore him 2 children in quick succession, a daughter named Octavia and a son named Britannicus. She managed his household, which was substantial, though not as grand as the imperial residences. She attended social functions appropriate to her station. She seemed, by all external measures, to be fulfilling her duties as an aristocratic Roman wife perfectly well. Then, everything changed. On January 24th, in the year 41 CE, 3 years after Messalina married Claudius, the Emperor Caligula was assassinated by officers of the Praetorian Guard in an underground passage beneath the palace. Caligula had ruled for less than 4 years. But those years had been characterized by increasing instability, cruelty, and erratic behavior that had alienated the Guard, the Senate, and large segments of the aristocracy. The assassins struck during the Palatine Games, killing Caligula and his wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, intending to eliminate the immediate imperial family and potentially restore some form of republican government, or at least choose a more suitable emperor. The assassination threw Rome into chaos. Who would rule now? The Senate convened emergency sessions to debate the future. Some senators argued for restoring the republic, ending the imperial system that had existed for less than a century. Others argued for choosing a new emperor from the remaining members of the imperial family. The Praetorian Guard, meanwhile, had their own interests to consider. They had been well paid and privileged under the emperors. A return to republican government might mean the end of their elite status and their financial privileges. But empires, once established, are difficult to dismantle. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit responsible for protecting the emperor, had an institutional interest in maintaining the imperial system because emperors were their primary source of income and privilege. Rather than allowing a potential return to republican governance, the Guard began searching the palace for surviving members of the imperial family who could be proclaimed the next emperor. They found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that he was about to be killed as part of a general purge of the Julio-Claudian line. According to the ancient sources, Claudius was nearly incoherent with fear, stammering and begging for his life, certain that the soldiers who found him had come to execute him as they had executed Caligula. But the guards had no intention of killing him. Instead, they recognized an opportunity. Here was a member of the imperial family who had no political base, no military following, no history of making enemies because he had been so thoroughly excluded from real power. He was perfect precisely because he was so harmless. He could be controlled. He would be grateful for being elevated rather than executed. And his legitimacy was unquestionable given his lineage. He was the brother of Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved generals, the uncle of Caligula, the grandson of Mark Antony, connected to Augustus through multiple family lines. No one could question his right to the position based on bloodline. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed Claudius emperor on the spot. They carried him on their shoulders to their camp outside the city. The Senate, which had been debating what to do after Caligula's assassination, found itself confronted with a fait accompli. The military had already chosen the next emperor. After some negotiations about privileges and immunities, and after receiving assurances that Claudius would respect senatorial prerogatives, the Senate formally confirmed Claudius as emperor. And in that moment, everything changed for Messalina. The 19-year-old wife of a marginalized scholar suddenly became the Empress of Rome, one of the most powerful women in the world. She had access to wealth and resources beyond calculation. The imperial treasury was at her disposal. She had influence over military appointments, political decisions, legal judgments, and economic policies that affected millions of people across the Roman Empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. She discovered that her beauty and charm, which would have been valuable assets in any aristocratic marriage, were now weapons of tremendous power when combined with the imperial position. And she discovered something else. Her husband Claudius, for all his intelligence and learning, was remarkably susceptible to manipulation. The ancient historians universally describe Claudius as someone who was brilliant in his scholarly pursuits, but surprisingly naive about human nature and interpersonal politics. He had spent most of his life being underestimated and marginalized by his family, treated as a figure of fun rather than as a serious person. He had few friends, and had never learned to read social cues effectively because his disabilities had isolated him from normal social development. Suddenly elevated to the highest position in Rome, he was uncertain and anxious, surrounded by palace freedmen and advisors who had their own agendas and who were far more experienced in political manipulation than he was. Into this environment stepped Messalina, beautiful, charming, confident in ways that Claudius was not. She quickly learned that she could influence her husband's decisions through a combination of physical attention, flattery, and strategic timing of her requests. The ancient historians describe her methods in terms that combine political skill with personal manipulation, painting a picture of a woman who understood instinctively how to manage a man who was insecure and desperate for affirmation. Messalina learned quickly how to manage Claudius. According to the sources, she would time her requests carefully, approaching Claudius when he was relaxed and receptive, perhaps after a good meal or when he was enjoying his wine. She would combine rational arguments with physical affection, making him associate agreement with pleasure and comfort. She would use tears and anger strategically when necessary, creating emotional scenes that Claudius would do anything to resolve because confrontation distressed him. She would withhold intimacy when Claudius displeased her and reward his cooperation with increased affection, creating a pattern of behavioral conditioning that shaped his responses. She also cultivated relationships with Claudius's most powerful freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, the former slaves who now managed the imperial bureaucracy and who wielded enormous unofficial power. Narcissus handled correspondence and communication, controlling what information reached the emperor and how it was presented. Pallas managed finances, controlling the vast imperial treasury and making decisions about expenditures and investments. Callistus dealt with petitions and legal matters, determining which cases reached the emperor's attention and how they were framed. These freedmen had risen from slavery to positions of enormous influence through their intelligence, administrative skill, and ability to make themselves indispensable. They understood better than almost anyone how power actually worked in imperial Rome, and they recognized immediately that the young Empress would be a force to be reckoned with. Messalina learned to work with each of them, figuring out what they wanted and what would buy their cooperation or at least their neutrality. Within a very short time, probably within the first year of Claudius's reign, Messalina had established herself as a power behind the throne, someone whose influence on the emperor was recognized by everyone in the palace and in the broader political world. People who wanted imperial favor learned to cultivate Messalina. Officials who wanted appointments learned to seek her support. Merchants who wanted government contracts learned that a gift to the Empress might smooth their path, and people who crossed her learned very quickly how dangerous that could be. But Messalina's power manifested in ways that went beyond simple political influence. According to every ancient source that mentions her, she had appetites for intimate relations that were both extraordinary and dangerous. Now, we need to pause here and consider the context of these accusations carefully and critically. Roman historians, all of them male, often used accusations of impropriety to discredit powerful women. It was a standard rhetorical move. A woman who exercised power inappropriately could be portrayed as morally deviant, with her political transgressions translated into personal scandals. We see this pattern repeatedly in ancient literature. Cleopatra, Agrippina the Younger, Julia the Elder, and numerous other women who wielded political power were described as having inappropriate relations or deviant behavior. So we should be appropriately skeptical of the most extreme claims about Messalina's personal behavior. Some of what the ancient historians recorded was probably exaggerated by enemies who wanted to destroy her reputation. Some was probably invented by political rivals who needed to justify her eventual execution. Some reflected misogynistic assumptions about female nature and female power rather than factual reporting about what Messalina actually did. But, and this is critically important, the sources about Messalina are remarkably consistent across multiple independent authors. Tacitus, writing decades after Messalina's death and drawing on contemporary records and eyewitness testimony, describes her behavior in terms that still seem shocking 2,000 years later. Suetonius, who had access to imperial archives and documents that no longer survive, corroborates the major outlines of Tacitus's account while adding additional details from official records. Cassius Dio, writing much later but drawing on earlier sources that are now lost, provides information that matches what the other historians recorded. And Juvenal, the satirical poet whose work was meant to critique rather than to chronicle, made Messalina's excesses the subject of some of his most famous verses. Verses that drew on stories that were apparently well known throughout Rome. The picture that emerges from these sources is of a woman whose behavior went far beyond what even Romans, who were relatively comfortable with relations between consenting adults and who accepted that powerful men routinely kept mistresses, considered normal or acceptable for an empress. Messalina allegedly took paramours constantly and in astonishing numbers. The sources claim she maintained dozens of simultaneous relationships with men from across the social spectrum, senators who needed imperial favor, equestrians seeking advancement, actors and poets who caught her fancy, gladiators whose physical prowess appealed to her, even slaves who served in the palace and who had no ability to refuse her advances. The sheer logistics of this alleged behavior are worth considering for a moment. If the sources are even partially accurate, Messalina must have spent enormous amounts of time and energy arranging these encounters, managing the secrecy required to prevent Claudius from learning about all of them, and dealing with the complex web of relationships and rivalries that would inevitably develop among so many paramours. This was not simple physical appetite. It was behavior that suggested compulsion, that demonstrated a psychology that needed conquest and variety and the thrill of transgression as much as, or more, than physical satisfaction. The ancient sources name numerous men as Messalina's companions. Senators like Trollus Montanus, described as a distinguished orator whose speeches in the Senate were widely admired until he became one of Messalina's favorites and subsequently lost all credibility among his colleagues. Suilius Caesoninus, another senator who initially opposed some of Messalina's political initiatives, but who became one of her most reliable supporters after entering into relations with her. Mnestor, a famous actor whose performances drew enormous crowds, but whose reputation was destroyed by his association with the Empress. Gladiators, whose identities were considered too unimportant to record by name, but whose involvement with an empress shocked Romans, because gladiators occupied the very lowest rungs of social status, despite their popularity in the arena. Even slaves from the imperial household, men who had absolutely no ability to refuse the empress's advances, and whose use represented the ultimate violation of social hierarchy. But Messalina did not simply pursue her own pleasure, as scandalous as that would have been for an empress. She weaponized intimate relations as a tool of political control and social dominance in ways that show remarkable sophistication and calculated cruelty. Let me tell you about her methods in detail, because understanding these reveals how someone can transform personal behavior into systematic political manipulation that destroys lives and maintains power through fear and compromise. First, Messalina used the promise of physical access to herself as a reward for loyalty and service. Men who supported her political agenda, who provided useful information about Senate deliberations or military matters, who did favors for her or for her associates, might receive invitations to private encounters in her chambers or at one of the estates she controlled outside the city. These encounters served multiple purposes simultaneously. They gratified Messalina's desires, certainly, but more importantly, they created bonds of complicity that made the men dependent on her secrecy and bound to her interests. These relationships were also traps. Once a man had been intimate with the Empress, which was technically treason under Roman law, since the Empress's person was sacrosanct and any violation of her marriage vows was, by definition, a crime against the state, he was permanently compromised. Messalina could threaten exposure at any time, which would lead to the man's disgrace, exile to a remote island, execution, and confiscation of all his property, leaving his family destitute. So these companions became her tools, bound to her through shared guilt, unable to refuse her demands without risking their own destruction and the destruction of everyone they cared about. The case of Suilius Caesoninus illustrates this pattern perfectly. He was a senator who initially opposed some of Messalina's initiatives in the Senate, voting against measures she favored and speaking eloquently about the need for senatorial independence from excessive imperial influence. Messalina targeted him deliberately. She arranged opportunities to be alone with him, deployed all her considerable charm and beauty, and ultimately seduced him in a way that made his involvement with her impossible to hide from other senators who observed them together at social functions. Afterward, Suilius's behavior changed completely. He became one of Messalina's most reliable supporters in the Senate, voting as she directed through intermediaries, arguing for policies she favored, serving essentially as her agent in senatorial deliberations because he understood that if he crossed her, she could reveal their relationship and destroy him. She had transformed an opponent into a tool through strategic use of intimate relations, combined with implicit threats. This was not romance or even simple physical desire. This was political calculation disguised as personal attraction. Second, Messalina sometimes forced men into relationships with her as a way of demonstrating dominance and creating leverage. Some of her companions were not willing participants in any meaningful sense. They were men who understood that refusing the Empress was dangerous, men who were coerced through threats against their families or their positions, men who complied out of fear rather than desire. The ancient sources make clear that consent in these situations was complicated at best and absent at worst. The Empress held absolute power over these men, and that power imbalance made genuine choice impossible. Nestor, the famous actor, was reportedly terrified of Messalina and tried to avoid her advances initially. Acting was a profession that was wildly popular with Roman audiences, but that was considered disreputable by the aristocracy. Actors occupied a strange position in society, celebrated by crowds, sometimes becoming wealthy through their performances and through gifts from admirers, but lacking social respectability and having limited legal rights. For an aristocratic woman to have relations with an actor was scandalous because of the status violation. For the Empress to have relations with an actor was catastrophic for the actor, because it made him the subject of gossip and mockery throughout Rome. According to the sources, Nestor understood this and tried to refuse Messalina's advances. But she reportedly threatened him, making clear that refusal would be treated as an insult to the imperial family and would lead to his destruction. She may also have enlisted Claudius's help. The sources suggest that Messalina convinced Claudius to order Nestor to obey the Empress in all things, and that Claudius issued this order without understanding that it would be used to force Nestor into an intimate relationship. Once he became her companion, Nestor's relationship with Messalina became the worst-kept secret in Rome, destroying his reputation and making him the subject of jokes, with people mocking both him for being used by the Empress and Claudius for being unable to control his wife. The psychological impact on these forced companions must have been profound. They were required to perform intimacy with someone they feared, to pretend desire for someone who had coerced them through threats or through abuse of power, to participate in their own degradation while understanding that any sign of reluctance or any attempt to escape would bring punishment. This was not romance or mutual attraction. This was violation of bodily autonomy disguised as imperial favor, the abuse of power that denied these men any real choice in the matter. Third, and perhaps most cruelly calculated, Messalina would seduce the husbands of women she wanted to humiliate or destroy. This was a deliberate strategy of social warfare, carried out with careful planning and execution. Ancient sources describe multiple instances where Messalina targeted the husband of a woman who had insulted her at a social function, or who had too much influence in aristocratic circles, or who simply displeased her in some trivial way that most people would have overlooked but that Messalina's pride could not tolerate. She would arrange opportunities to be alone with the targeted woman's husband, would deploy all her considerable charm and beauty along with the allure of imperial favor and advancement, would seduce or coerce him into betraying his marriage. Then Messalina would ensure the wife found out about the betrayal. Sometimes this was done subtly, a word dropped in the right ear at a dinner party, a letter left where the wife would find it, an arranged encounter where the wife would walk in on something compromising. Sometimes it was done openly, Messalina would flaunt the relationship, appear in public with the man, in ways that made the situation obvious to everyone. Discuss the affair in social situations where the news would spread rapidly through Rome's gossip networks. For aristocratic Roman women, this represented social death. A woman whose husband had been unfaithful with the Empress was humiliated before her entire social circle. Her marriage was destroyed or permanently damaged. Her position in society was undermined because people questioned what she had done to drive her husband to such behavior. Her children would grow up knowing their father had betrayed their mother with the Empress. The psychological damage was immense and lasting, and then, often, Messalina would take the destruction even further. She would use the relationship she had engineered as a weapon against both the husband and the wife. The husband would be accused of some crime, treason, conspiracy, embezzlement, charges that were easy to fabricate in imperial Rome and difficult to defend against in a system where the emperor's word was final and where standard rules of evidence could be suspended. The husband would be executed or forced to commit suicide or exiled to a remote island, his property confiscated by the imperial treasury. The wife, already humiliated by the infidelity, would now be impoverished and alone, stripped of her husband's property and income, possibly forced to leave Rome, her entire life destroyed by a woman she had offended in some trivial way months or years earlier. Vestilia was one such victim, her story preserved in fragments of historical accounts. She was an aristocratic woman from a distinguished family who had reportedly made some comment at a dinner party that was perceived as critical of Messalina's taste in entertainment or her patronage of certain actors. It was the sort of casual social comment that would normally have been forgotten within days, but Messalina remembered. Within months she had arranged to meet Vestilia's husband at a social function, had seduced him using all her arts and the promise of imperial advancement, and had let Vestilia discover the relationship in the most humiliating way possible by ensuring they were seen together at the theater. Then Messalina arranged for Vestilia's husband to be accused of conspiracy, fabricating evidence that he had been meeting with disaffected senators and planning to overthrow Claudius. The case was heard in Claudius's chambers with Messalina present to influence the proceedings. Despite the husband's protests of innocence, he was found guilty and executed. Vestilia's property was confiscated along with her husband's, leaving her destitute. She died in poverty within a year, her health and spirit broken, her life completely destroyed by Messalina's calculated revenge for a casual insult. Fourth, Messalina created an intelligence network built on her intimate relationships that gave her extraordinary insight into Roman politics and society. Men who visited her chambers would be questioned about what they knew, political gossip from the Senate about which senators were forming alliances or rivalries, military information from officers about troop movements and command assignments, financial details from merchants and tax collectors about trade and revenue, social intelligence about rivalries and alliances among aristocratic families. The setting was intimate and private. The questioning seemed casual and conversational, and men relaxed by physical satisfaction and by the flattery of the Empress seeking their opinions would often share information more freely than they would in formal interrogations or official meetings. This intelligence network was remarkably effective and gave Messalina advantages that other political figures lacked. She seemed to know everything that was happening in Rome before anyone else. She knew about plots and conspiracies before they matured into actual threats, allowing her to neutralize them early. She knew about rivals' weaknesses and vulnerabilities before those rivals even realized they had made themselves vulnerable. She knew about political and financial opportunities before others could exploit them, allowing her to position herself or her allies advantageously. This knowledge, gathered through private conversations and passed along by companions trying to please her or to secure her continued favor, made her one of the best-informed people in the empire, and allowed her to stay ahead of potential threats and challenges to her position. But Messalina's manipulations went beyond intimate politics. She was also deeply involved in the political prosecutions and property confiscations that characterized Claudius's reign, and she used her influence over her husband to orchestrate the destruction of numerous people whose only crimes were being in her way, or possessing something she wanted. Let me tell you about Valerius Asiaticus in detail, because his case exemplifies perfectly how Messalina operated and reveals the absolute cynicism and calculated cruelty of her methods. Valerius Asiaticus was a senator of immense wealth and prestige. He had been consul twice, the highest regular political office in Rome, an honor that most senators never achieved even once. He had vast estates throughout Italy and Gaul, properties that generated enormous income, and that made him one of the wealthiest men in the empire. And he owned the gardens of Lucullus in Rome, one of the most beautiful private estates in the city, famous for its landscaping by renowned designers, its collection of artwork by the finest sculptors and painters, and its stunning views of the city from the Pincian Hill. Messalina wanted those gardens. The ancient sources disagree about her exact motivation. Tacitus suggests she genuinely loved the property and wanted it for herself, visiting it on multiple occasions and envisioning how she would redesign certain areas. Cassius Dio implies she saw an opportunity to acquire something valuable and couldn't resist the temptation, even though she had no particular need for another estate. Some modern historians speculate that destroying Asiaticus and taking his property was primarily about demonstrating her power, showing that she could target even the wealthiest and most distinguished senators and destroy them utterly. Whatever the motivation, Messalina decided to acquire the gardens of Lucullus, which meant she needed to destroy Valerius Asiaticus. She couldn't simply ask Claudius to confiscate the property. Even an emperor needed at least some pretext for seizing a senator's estate, and Asiaticus had done nothing wrong. So Messalina orchestrated an elaborate frame-up, working with Suilius Cessaninus, the same senator who had become her tool after being compromised through a relationship with her, to develop accusations that Asiaticus was plotting to overthrow Claudius and make himself emperor. The evidence was completely manufactured. Witnesses were coached or coerced into giving testimony that supported the conspiracy narrative. Letters were forged, suggesting that Asiaticus had been meeting secretly with military commanders. Financial records were altered to suggest he had been accumulating unusual amounts of cash, which was presented as evidence that he was planning to bribe soldiers. The case was carefully constructed to appear plausible while being entirely false. The accusations were presented to Claudius as a serious threat that required immediate action. Messalina emphasized how dangerous Asiaticus was, how his wealth and connections made him uniquely capable of challenging imperial authority, how failure to act quickly might give him time to activate his conspiracy. Claudius, trusting his wife and his advisors, ordered a trial. But the trial was held not in the Senate or in a public forum where Asiaticus might have had some chance of defending himself effectively, but in Claudius's own bedchamber, with Messalina present throughout to ensure the proceedings went exactly as she wanted. Asiaticus was brought before the emperor and his accusers, forced to defend himself against charges he knew were false but could not effectively refute because the entire system was rigged against him. The witnesses had been carefully prepared, their stories coordinated. The documentary evidence had been fabricated by people with access to official seals and archives. The judges, really just Claudius and his closest advisors, had already been influenced by Messalina's constant insistence on Asiaticus's guilt. According to Tacitus's detailed account, Asiaticus gave a powerful defense despite the hopelessness of his situation. He spoke eloquently about his service to Rome, his loyalty to the emperor, the absurdity of claiming that a man of his age and his accomplishments would suddenly decide to risk everything on a desperate conspiracy. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the testimony against him, the lack of any credible motive for him to act as accused. For a moment, it seemed like his defense might work, that Claudius might recognize the accusations were false and dismiss the charges. Then Messalina intervened directly. She began to cry, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about how betrayed she felt by Asiaticus, whom she had considered a friend. She spoke about how painful it was to discover that someone she had trusted had been plotting against her beloved husband. She described her fear that the conspiracy might have succeeded if loyal servants had not uncovered it in time. She made the case personal and emotional rather than legal and rational, playing on Claudius's feelings for her and his desire to protect her from distress. And Claudius, unable to bear his wife's tears or unwilling to contradict her in front of the assembled court, unable to believe that the woman he loved would lie about something so serious, condemned Asiaticus to death despite the weakness of the evidence and the strength of the defense. Asiaticus was given the option of taking his own life, which was considered more honorable than execution, and which allowed his family to retain at least some portion of his property rather than having everything confiscated. He chose this option, reportedly dying with remarkable dignity and courage. According to the accounts, he opened his veins in the traditional Roman fashion while reclining in his beloved gardens, bleeding to death over several hours while maintaining his composure to the end, giving instructions about his funeral arrangements and saying goodbye to the few friends brave enough to visit him. Immediately after his death, before his body was even cold, Messalina claimed the gardens of Lucullus as imperial property. She moved into them within days, began making plans for renovations and additions, held parties there for her favorites. She had orchestrated a man's death specifically to acquire his estate, and she showed absolutely no shame or regret about it. The gardens became one of her favorite properties, a place where she could host select gatherings, away from the formality of the main palace, where she could pursue her pleasures in relative privacy behind the estate's walls. This case was not unique or exceptional in Messalina's reign. Tacitus and the other ancient historians provide long lists of senators and equestrians who were executed, exiled, or forced to suicide during Claudius's reign, many of them at Messalina's instigation, and often for reasons that had nothing to do with actual threats to the state. The pattern was consistent and predictable. Someone would come to Messalina's attention as either a threat to her position or an obstacle to something she wanted. She would work with her network of compromised senators and cooperative freedmen to fabricate charges. She would influence Claudius to believe the accusations through a combination of tears and arguments and appeals to his security, and the person would be eliminated. Decrius Calpurnianus was executed because he owned estates in Campania that Messalina wanted for one of her favorites. Poppaeus Rufinus was destroyed because his wife had insulted Messalina at a party by suggesting that the Empress's taste in entertainment was becoming too common. Trollus Montanus was killed because he had been Messalina's companion, but had tried to end the relationship when he became engaged to Mary, and she punished him for rejecting her by having him accused of conspiracy. The list went on and on, a catalogue of destroyed lives that testified to Messalina's casual cruelty and her complete lack of restraint. The reign of terror Messalina created made everyone in Roman high society constantly fearful. No one knew when they might do or say something that would bring them to the Empress's negative attention. People became paranoid about their conversations, watching their words even among supposed friends, because anyone might be an informer, hoping to gain favor by reporting something suspicious. They avoided potentially controversial positions on political issues, because taking a stand might make them seem like threats. They tried desperately to stay beneath Messalina's notice, because being noticed by her was dangerous unless you were one of her favorites. And even her favorites could fall from favor suddenly and catastrophically for reasons that were often unclear. The psychological impact of living under this kind of regime was profound and damaging to Roman political culture. Ancient sources describe how senators would wake up each morning grateful to have survived another night, how they would kiss their children goodbye each morning, uncertain whether they would return that evening, how they would avoid social gatherings where they might say something that could be misinterpreted and reported and used against them. Rome, under Messalina's influence, was a city living in fear, where political power had been corrupted into pure predation, where survival often mattered more than principle or honor. Now, you might reasonably wonder, where was Claudius during all of this? How could an intelligent man, an educated scholar who had studied history and politics his entire life and who had written learned books about various subjects, be so blind to what his wife was doing? How could he not see that his court was becoming a place of systematic corruption and terror? The ancient historians struggled with this question too, and their answers reveal something important about the dynamics of power and manipulation in imperial Rome. First, Claudius was surrounded by freedmen, former slaves like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, who now managed the imperial bureaucracy, who had their own reasons for tolerating or even enabling Messalina's behavior up to a point. These men had achieved positions of enormous influence despite their origins as slaves, and they had learned that the way to maintain their positions was to make themselves indispensable to the emperor, while also maintaining workable relationships with the Empress, who might otherwise make their lives difficult or impossible. These freedmen were nothing if not pragmatic. They would cooperate with Messalina when it suited their purposes, or when opposing her would be more costly than cooperating. They would enable some of her schemes when doing so, advance their own interests, or when they calculated that the schemes weren't dangerous enough to justify the risk of opposing them. But they were also watching her constantly, gathering information about her activities, maintaining their own intelligence networks, preparing for the day when she might go too far and need to be stopped to protect their own positions and the stability of Claudius's reign. For years, that balance worked. Messalina's excesses were contained or managed in ways that prevented them from becoming existential threats to Claudius's reign or to the freedmen's positions. Second, Claudius had a significant blind spot regarding Messalina that the ancient historians attributed partly to genuine affection and partly to manipulation. Messalina was beautiful, charming when she wanted to be, and remarkably skilled at managing her husband's perceptions. She would present situations to him in ways that made her actions seem reasonable or necessary. She would cry and express distress that would motivate Claudius to act in ways that served her interests. She would use physical intimacy as both reward and manipulation, creating emotional bonds that made Claudius reluctant to believe negative information about her, because believing it would require him to acknowledge that his judgment was so poor he couldn't even recognize his own wife's deception. Third, and perhaps most importantly, many of Messalina's relationships and activities were either hidden from Claudius entirely or presented to him in ways that made them seem innocent, or at least non-threatening. Menestor, the actor, was presented as entertainment and cultural patronage, with Messalina explaining that she enjoyed supporting the theatrical arts. Male visitors to her chambers were explained as consultations on political or administrative matters, with Messalina claiming to be helping Claudius by gathering information and building support. The parties she hosted were described as social networking that benefited imperial interests. When rumors did reach Claudius, and surely some rumors must have reached him given how widespread the gossip was, Messalina would dismiss them as slander from enemies who wanted to damage her reputation and drive a wedge between husband and wife. And Claudius would believe her because he wanted to believe her, because the alternative was too painful to accept. The ancient historians portray Claudius during this period as pathetic, a brilliant scholar reduced to a deceived husband who couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else in Rome, a powerful emperor who was manipulated by his wife and his advisors. Modern readers might be tempted to view him with contempt for his apparent blindness, but I think the reality was more complex and more tragic than simple foolishness. Claudius was caught in a psychological trap that many people in manipulative or abusive relationships experience. He had been trained his entire life by his family to doubt his own perceptions. They had always told him he was incompetent, that his disabilities made him unsuitable for important roles, that he couldn't trust his own judgment. Then he became emperor, and suddenly had to make life and death decisions daily, affecting millions of people. Messalina represented stability and support in his world of overwhelming uncertainty and responsibility. She was beautiful and charming. She told him he was wise and capable. She made him feel valued as a person, rather than pitied as a disabled embarrassment. Believing that she was betraying him would have required admitting that his judgment was so poor he couldn't even recognize his own wife's deception, which would have reinforced all the negative messages his family had spent decades drilling into him about his incompetence and unreliability. It would have meant acknowledging that the one person he trusted and relied on was actually manipulating him for her own purposes. That recognition would have been psychologically devastating, calling into question everything about his sense of reality and his ability to function as emperor. So Claudius chose, probably unconsciously, to not see what was happening around him. He accepted explanations that preserved his sense of reality and his sense of himself as competent and capable. He convinced himself that rumors about Messalina were enemy propaganda designed to destabilize his reign. He focused on his scholarly interests and his administrative work, and let his wife manage aspects of palace life that he found unpleasant or confusing. This willful blindness allowed Messalina to operate with increasing boldness for nearly 7 years, from 41 CE, when Claudius became emperor, until 48 CE, when everything collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. Now let me return to that house in the Suburra, to the scene I opened with, because we need to address directly the most famous or infamous story about Messalina's behavior. The slave, Thrasus, remember, was sitting on a stool in the corner, having been brought there to learn what discretion means, ordered to watch but not interfere, terrified and confused about what he was about to witness. What Thrasus allegedly witnessed over the following hours, according to the ancient sources that describe Messalina's nocturnal adventures, was the Empress working as one of the women of the night in this establishment. She took customer after customer, men who had no idea they were paying for companionship with the Empress of Rome, men who thought they were just purchasing the services of a particularly attractive woman working under the pseudonym Lysiska, which means she-wolf, a term that was Roman slang for women who sold companionship, but that also evoked the legendary she-wolf that had nursed Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. According to Juvenal's satirical poem describing this behavior, she would compete with professional courtesans to see who could accommodate the most clients in a night, and she would win these competitions, demonstrating physical endurance that seemed superhuman. The poet describes how Messalina would finally leave the establishment at dawn, exhausted by men but not yet satisfied, and return to the palace before Claudius awakened, changing back into her imperial robes, and resuming her role as empress, as though nothing unusual had happened. The implication in Juvenal's account was that no amount of intimate activity could actually satisfy her desires, that she was driven by appetites that were fundamentally insatiable, that she sought not just physical pleasure, but the transgressive thrill of degradation and boundary crossing. Now, we must be extremely careful and critical about this story. Juvenal was writing satire, not history. His purpose was to critique Roman decadence and moral corruption among the aristocracy, and he used Messalina as the ultimate symbol of aristocratic depravity and the corruption that unlimited power could produce. He was writing several decades after Messalina's death, drawing on stories that had likely been exaggerated substantially in the retelling, and that may have become detached from whatever factual basis they originally had. He was crafting his account for maximum rhetorical impact and shock value, rather than for factual accuracy or historical precision. So, did Messalina actually work in such an establishment in disguise? The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty, and we probably can't ever know given the limitations of our sources. The story may be completely fabricated, invented as a metaphor for moral corruption that was then repeated, so often it came to be treated as historical fact. Or it may have a kernel of truth. Perhaps Messalina did occasionally venture into the city in disguise for anonymous encounters that gave her the thrill of transgression and anonymity, and this behavior was later exaggerated and dramatized into the full account of regular visits to a house of ill repute. Or it may even be substantially true, with Messalina pursuing transgression to such an extreme that working as one of these women seemed like the ultimate boundary to cross, the ultimate way to violate every social norm and prove that she could do absolutely anything. What we can say with confidence is that the story became absolutely central to Messalina's historical reputation, precisely because it crystallized in one vivid and shocking image everything that Romans found disturbing about her. The Empress, the most powerful woman in the empire, living in luxury beyond imagination, married to the emperor himself, voluntarily placing herself in the most degraded position possible, working as a common courtesan, doing so not for money or survival, but purely for the thrill of transgression and the experience of violating every possible social boundary. This image captured something profound about power corrupted, about how privilege can create needs that normal satisfactions can't fulfill, about how transgression itself can become the desired experience, rather than any specific physical act. The story also served an important narrative function in the ancient accounts. It demonstrated that Messalina's behavior had gone beyond anything that could be tolerated or overlooked by responsible administrators, that she had moved from scandalous but potentially manageable relationships into territory that was genuinely dangerous to the stability and legitimacy of Claudius's reign, whether literally true or symbolically true. The story of the visits to the house in the Suburra marked Messalina as someone whose corruption was complete and whose behavior could no longer be contained or managed by the freedmen who had been balancing their cooperation with her, against their loyalty to Claudius and to the stability of the empire. Related to this story is another famous anecdote that Juvenal and other sources record, the alleged competition between Messalina and a famous courtesan named Scylla. According to this story, Messalina challenged Scylla to a contest to determine who could be intimate with more men in a 24-hour period. The competition supposedly took place in one of Rome's establishments, with both women taking client after client through the day and night, until Messalina won by accommodating 25 men to Scylla's 22. Again, the literal truth of this story is highly questionable. The numbers are suspiciously round and may have been chosen for symbolic or rhetorical reasons, rather than because they represent actual counts. The story has the quality of urban legend, the sort of shocking tale that gets repeated and embellished with each retelling, accumulating dramatic details that make it more memorable but less historically reliable. But true or not in its specific details, the story became part of Messalina's legend, one more example of her alleged insatiability and her need to prove her superiority even in degradation, to dominate even in contexts where domination seems impossible. What these stories, the house of ill repute, the competition, the countless companions, what they collectively suggest is not just a woman who enjoyed intimate relations, but someone for whom such encounters had become compulsive and who needed increasingly extreme experiences to feel satisfied or stimulated. Modern psychology recognizes hypersexuality as a potential symptom of various psychological conditions, including bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, certain forms of trauma response, and other issues. People experiencing hypersexuality describe it as being driven by compulsions they can't fully control, needing encounters constantly, even when those encounters bring more problems than pleasure, seeking increasingly extreme or risky situations as tolerance builds and normal experiences lose their impact. If Messalina was experiencing something like clinical hypersexuality, that would explain many aspects of her behavior that seem otherwise incomprehensible from a rational perspective. The constant pursuit of new companions, despite enormous risks to her position, and even to her life, the boundary crossing that led her to pursue men across social hierarchies from the most distinguished senators to the lowest slaves, the alleged need for extreme numbers of encounters that went far beyond what would satisfy ordinary physical desires, the possible pursuit of degrading experiences, like working in a house of ill repute, not despite, but because of the degradation involved, seeking the thrill of violating every possible social norm and experiencing the ultimate transgression. But we must be very careful about trying to medicalize or excuse behavior, that was also deliberately cruel and destructive to others. Whatever psychological factors may have driven Messalina's compulsive pursuit of intimate relations, she also made conscious choices to weaponize such relations for political purposes, to destroy people who threatened her position or who simply annoyed her, to orchestrate murders and property confiscations to acquire things she wanted. She was responsible for her actions and their consequences, even if she was also driven by psychological factors she didn't fully understand or couldn't completely control. Understanding potential psychological motivations does not absolve someone of responsibility for harm they cause to others. And ultimately, Messalina's behavior, whether driven by psychological compulsion, by the corruption that absolute power produces, by boredom and the need for stimulation that unlimited privilege creates, or by some combination of all these factors, led her to commit an act so audacious and so seemingly insane that it destroyed all the protective structures that had kept her safe despite years of scandalous behavior. Let me tell you now about the Gaius Silius affair, about the scandal that ended Messalina's life, and that still seems almost unbelievable in its boldness, even knowing what we know about her previous behavior. Gaius Silius was, according to all the ancient sources, the handsomest man in Rome. This was not just subjective opinion, but apparently widespread consensus. He was famous for his physical beauty, in a culture that appreciated male beauty openly, and where such attributes could genuinely contribute to social success. He came from a distinguished family. His father had been a prominent general during Germanicus's campaigns in Germany, earning honors and building a reputation that gave the family prestige. Gaius himself held the position of consul designate, meaning he was scheduled to become consul in the near future, one of the highest regular offices in Rome that would cement his status among the elite. He was married to Junia Silana, a woman from another distinguished family with her own wealth and connections. By every measure, Gaius Silius was successful, respected, positioned for continued advancement through the ranks of Roman power. Then Messalina noticed him. According to Tacitus, who provides the most detailed account, she became infatuated with Silius in a way that was different from her many other relationships. This wasn't just another conquest or another tool for her political network. She genuinely desired him, wanted him for reasons that went beyond political calculation. She pursued him openly and aggressively in ways that made her interest clear to everyone in their social circle. She sent him expensive gifts, jewelry, horses, furnishings for his home. She appeared at his house unannounced, an extraordinary breach of social protocol that shocked his neighbors and servants. She invited him to parties and seated him in places of honor. She made her attraction to him obvious to anyone who saw them together. Silius, faced with such obvious advances from the Empress, initially tried to resist or at least to manage the situation carefully. He understood perfectly well that a relationship with Messalina was extraordinarily dangerous. If Claudius ever found out, Silius would be executed immediately for treason without any possibility of defense or escape. The crime of violating the Empress's marriage vows was one of the most serious possible offenses, considered equivalent to attacking the emperor himself. No amount of social status or family connections could protect someone accused of such a crime. But Messalina made it clear that refusing her advances would be even more dangerous than accepting them. She let him know, through intermediaries, and eventually, directly, that she could destroy him for rejecting her, just as easily as Claudius could destroy him for accepting her. She controlled enough of the imperial machinery through her network of compromised officials and cooperative freedmen that she could fabricate charges against him, arrange his prosecution, and engineer his death if he insulted her by refusing. Silius was trapped between two equally dangerous choices: accept the Empress's advances and risk Claudius finding out, or refuse and risk Messalina's immediate revenge. So Silius became Messalina's companion, entering into what would prove to be the most fateful relationship of her life. And unlike her previous relationships, which she had at least made some minimal effort to conceal or disguise through plausible explanations, the relationship with Silius was conducted almost completely openly. They were seen together constantly throughout Rome. They appeared at the theater sitting together in prominent boxes where everyone could see them. They held dinner parties where they entertained guests as though they were a couple. Messalina gave Silius expensive and conspicuous gifts, including property and artwork that had been confiscated from people she had destroyed through false accusations. She promoted his career through her influence with Claudius, ensuring he received honors and appointments that advanced him rapidly. All of Rome gossiped about the relationship. How could they not? The Empress was openly conducting what appeared to be a romantic relationship with the handsomest man in Rome, and the Emperor either didn't know or didn't care enough to stop it. The situation was bizarre, unprecedented in its brazenness, obviously dangerous for everyone involved. People whispered that Messalina had lost her mind, that she was going to get herself and Silius killed, that Claudius would eventually have to notice and respond with terrible consequences. But months passed, and nothing happened. Claudius continued with his administrative work, his scholarly pursuits, his public duties, apparently oblivious to his wife's flagrant infidelity that was the talk of the city. Then, in the autumn of 48 CE, Messalina and Silius made a decision that surpassed all their previous audacity, and that would prove to be the fatal mistake that destroyed them both. Claudius was scheduled to travel to Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber, to inspect grain shipments and oversee administrative matters related to Rome's food supply. He would be gone for several days, and during his absence, while the emperor was away from Rome, Messalina and Silius decided to hold a wedding ceremony, a full, formal, traditional Roman wedding with all the customary rituals and celebrations. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means, because the full audacity and impossibility of it needs to be understood. Messalina was still legally married to Claudius. Claudius was still alive, still emperor, still Messalina's legal husband under Roman law. Divorce required formal procedures that had not been undertaken. But Messalina and Silius decided to conduct a formal Roman wedding ceremony anyway, complete with all the traditional rituals that marked a legitimate marriage, witnessed by hundreds of guests, including senators and other officials, creating a second marriage that existed simultaneously with Messalina's existing marriage to the emperor. This was not a secret ceremony in a hidden location. This was a public event with hundreds of witnesses, held at one of Messalina's estates outside Rome, conducted according to all proper forms. Messalina wore a wedding veil and traditional bridal clothing. Silius wore formal dress, appropriate for a groom. They joined hands in the traditional gesture. They exchanged vows before witnesses. They made sacrifices to the gods. They held an elaborate wedding feast with entertainment and celebration. They acted out the complete theater of a Roman aristocratic wedding, as though nothing about the situation was impossible or insane. The ancient historians struggled to explain this act, and modern historians continue to debate what Messalina and Silius thought they were doing. Some possibilities that have been suggested include, it may have been part of a coup attempt. By marrying Silius while Claudius still lived, Messalina might have been trying to transfer legitimacy to Silius, positioning him as her legal husband, and therefore as someone who could claim imperial authority as the husband of Augustus's direct descendant. If Claudius conveniently died, or could be declared incompetent, Silius could potentially claim the throne as Messalina's legitimate husband, especially if they had built sufficient support among key senators and Praetorian Guard commanders. The marriage would then be the opening move in a plan to replace Claudius. Messalina may have become so delusional about her power and her immunity from consequences that she genuinely believed she could marry Silius while remaining married to Claudius, and that this would somehow be acceptable. 7 years of getting away with increasingly outrageous behavior, 7 years of facing no real consequences for actions that would have destroyed anyone else, may have created in her a sense of omnipotence, a belief that normal rules simply didn't apply to her, and that she could literally redefine social and legal norms through her will. Silius may have pushed for the marriage, calculating that it gave him a path to power and convincing Messalina that they had enough support to make it work. Ancient sources suggest he was ambitious and that he may have seen in this bizarre situation an opportunity to position himself as the next emperor. He may have convinced Messalina that the marriage would strengthen both of them politically, and that Claudius was weak enough that he could be neutralized if he objected. It may have combined elements of all these motivations: political calculation mixed with psychological delusion, mixed with the pure transgressive thrill of doing something so completely forbidden that it seemed almost impossible. Whatever drove them to this decision, the wedding happened. Hundreds of people attended and witnessed it. The celebration was reportedly wild and excessive, with drinking and entertainment and behavior that violated normal social propriety even at Roman aristocratic parties. And then, because Rome's political and intelligence networks were sophisticated, and because powerful people had their own sources of information, word of the wedding reached Narcissus, the freedman who managed Claudius's correspondence, and who had been watching Messalina carefully for years, waiting for the moment when she would cross a line that could not be ignored or explained away. Narcissus understood immediately that this was that moment. The wedding was not just another scandal that could be managed or overlooked or explained away as malicious gossip. It was a direct threat to Claudius's authority, to his legitimacy as emperor, possibly to his life. If Messalina could marry another man while Claudius lived, if she could conduct this marriage publicly with senatorial witnesses and face no consequences, then Claudius's power was meaningless. Everyone would understand that the emperor was so weak he couldn't even control his own wife. The marriage suggested either that Messalina and Silius were planning to replace Claudius immediately, or that they believed Claudius was so impotent that they could do absolutely anything without consequence. Either interpretation was unacceptable and required immediate, decisive action. Narcissus sent urgent messages to Claudius at Ostia, informing him of the wedding in stark terms and urging him to return to Rome immediately with loyal guards. According to Tacitus's detailed account, Claudius initially refused to believe the reports. His wife had married another man? Publicly? With witnesses and a feast? While he was alive? It seemed impossible, absurd, the sort of malicious rumor that must be based on misunderstanding or deliberate lies designed to drive a wedge between husband and wife. But Narcissus had prepared carefully for this moment of disbelief. He brought witnesses who had personally attended the wedding, who could describe in specific detail what they had seen: the veil Messalina wore, the vows that were exchanged, the feast that followed. He presented physical evidence, including invitations to the wedding that had been sent to various guests. He provided testimony from multiple independent sources that all corroborated the same basic facts. He made the reality undeniable, forcing Claudius to confront what he had been avoiding for years. Claudius's reaction was not rage or righteous anger, but fear. He understood immediately that if Messalina and Silius were bold enough to hold a public wedding, they must have support, must have been planning something, must represent a genuine threat to his position and possibly to his life. He feared assassination, feared that he would be killed to clear the way for Silius to claim the throne as Messalina's legitimate husband. So, rather than immediately confronting Messalina or marching back to Rome in anger, Claudius fled. He surrounded himself with guards who were loyal to Narcissus rather than potentially to Messalina, and he made his way back to Rome under heavy protection, while Narcissus moved rapidly to secure the palace and arrest everyone involved in the conspiracy. The speed and efficiency with which Narcissus acted suggests he had been preparing for this moment for some time, possibly for years. He had lists ready of everyone who needed to be arrested, everyone who had attended the wedding, everyone who had been closely associated with Messalina's political network, everyone who might resist or interfere with eliminating her. He had guard commanders who were loyal to him rather than to Messalina, and who could be trusted to carry out arrests without warning her. He moved through the palace and through the city methodically, rounding up conspirators and witnesses and anyone who might complicate the situation. Silius was arrested at the Senate House, where he had gone to attend to normal senatorial business, apparently still believing he could pretend everything was normal, or perhaps not yet fully understanding that the situation had collapsed. He was executed immediately, without trial or opportunity to defend himself, along with dozens of others who had attended the wedding or who were suspected of supporting Messalina's political network. The executions were swift and brutal. These were not judicial proceedings with formalities and due process, but emergency measures to eliminate a perceived coup attempt. Bodies accumulated in the forum and in palace courtyards as Narcissus and his allies worked through their lists of targets. By the end of the day, most of Messalina's closest associates were dead. Messalina, when she learned what was happening, fled to the gardens of Lucullus, those same gardens she had stolen from Valerius Asiaticus just a few years earlier through her fabricated treason charges, which now became the setting for her own final hours. She was there with her mother Lepida and her 2 children, her son Britannicus, who was about 7 years old, and her daughter Octavia, who was perhaps 9. The ancient sources describe her as alternating rapidly between panic and denial, unable to fully process that everything had collapsed so completely and so quickly, unable to believe that her power and her position could be stripped away in a matter of hours. She tried desperately to draft letters to Claudius begging for mercy, trying to explain the wedding as a misunderstanding or as something she had been forced into by Silius. She apparently still believed that if she could just get face-to-face with Claudius one more time, she could use her skills of manipulation to convince him to spare her, could deploy tears and protestations of love to make him forgive her as he had apparently forgiven or overlooked so many previous transgressions. But Narcissus understood perfectly that Messalina could never be allowed near Claudius again. If they met, if she had a chance to work her usual psychological manipulations and emotional appeals, there was a real and substantial possibility that Claudius would forgive her or at least spare her life, unable to bear ordering the execution of the woman he had loved for 7 years. And that would be catastrophically dangerous for Narcissus and everyone else who had moved against her. If Messalina survived, she would take revenge on all of them as soon as the immediate crisis passed. She had to be eliminated before Claudius could reconsider, or before his emotions could overcome his judgment. Narcissus sent a tribune named Evadus with clear and unambiguous orders. Secure Messalina, and ensure she died, either by her own hand, which would be preferable, or by his, if necessary. When Evadus arrived at the gardens of Lucullus with a squad of soldiers, he found Messalina with her mother Lepida. According to Tacitus's detailed and moving account, Lepida, who had been estranged from her daughter for years because she disapproved of Messalina's behavior and had tried unsuccessfully to counsel her toward restraint, was now trying to convince Messalina to die with dignity, to take her own life in the traditional Roman fashion, and at least preserve some shred of honor for her children, who would have to live with their mother's reputation. In Roman culture, suicide in certain circumstances was not shameful but could be noble and honorable. A person condemned by the emperor could choose to die by their own hand rather than face public execution, and this choice meant they died as a free Roman making their own final decision rather than as a convict being executed by the state. It also meant that at least some of their property could pass to their children rather than being entirely confiscated by the imperial treasury. Lepida was offering her daughter this final mercy, the chance to die as a Roman aristocrat rather than as a condemned criminal, the chance to give her children at least some material inheritance, and perhaps some small preservation of family honor. But Messalina couldn't do it. Ancient accounts describe her as frozen, unable to take action even as her mother urged her, and as they heard the soldiers outside preparing to come in. She picked up a dagger that Lepida provided, held it in shaking hands, brought it toward her throat or her wrist, but she couldn't complete the act. She had spent her entire adult life getting what she wanted through a combination of charm and threats and manipulation, escaping consequences through her beauty and intelligence and position, never really believing that there were some situations where her usual strategies wouldn't work. Now, faced with an unmanipulable reality where all her abilities were useless, where death was inevitable, and the only question was how it would happen, She simply couldn't function. She stood there, holding the dagger, her mother begging her to act, the soldiers approaching, but she was psychologically paralyzed. Evidus, watching this scene for several long moments, and following his orders from Narcissus, finally stepped forward and killed her himself. Tacitus doesn't specify the exact method in his account. He says simply that Evidus struck her down with his sword, sparing readers the explicit details. Messalina died there in the gardens, at age 28, killed by a mid-ranking military officer following orders from a former slave, her extraordinary life ending in a place she had acquired through murder. Her body was given to her mother Lepida for burial. Claudius, kept carefully away from the execution by Narcissus's careful management and coordination, was informed that Messalina was dead while he was at dinner that evening. According to Suetonius's account, Claudius showed no particular emotion when given the news. He didn't weep or express grief or anger or even relief. He didn't ask questions about exactly how she had died or whether she had said anything final. He simply continued eating and drinking, called for more wine, and never mentioned her name again that evening or apparently ever afterward. The woman he had been married to for 10 years, the mother of his children, simply ceased to exist for him. In the following days and weeks, Claudius issued no public statements about Messalina's death. He didn't explain what had happened, didn't justify her execution to the Senate or to the Roman people, didn't acknowledge publicly that anything unusual had occurred. He simply moved forward with imperial business, as though Messalina had never existed, as though the past 7 years of scandal and manipulation had been erased from history, as though he could restore order and legitimacy to his reign simply by refusing to acknowledge what had happened. The Senate, following Claudius's lead and recognizing which way political winds were blowing, ordered a damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of memory. This was a standard Roman practice for dealing with people who had betrayed the state or the emperor. Messalina's name was to be erased from public inscriptions wherever it appeared. Statues of her were to be removed or defaced so they could no longer be recognized. Official records were to be altered to minimize her role in events when possible, and to remove her name entirely when feasible. The goal was to obliterate her from history, to make it as though she had never been empress, to erase the memory of her scandals and crimes, so that they wouldn't continue to damage Claudius's reputation or the dignity of the imperial office. But of course, the attempt to erase Messalina from history failed completely and spectacularly. The story was too sensational, the scandals too shocking, the whole arc of her life too perfect as a morality tale about power and corruption for it to be forgotten. Instead of fading from memory as the Senate intended, Messalina's story was preserved in extensive detail by multiple historians who recorded everything they could learn about her behavior. The poets made her the ultimate symbol of female depravity and corrupt power, using her name as shorthand for moral corruption and insatiable appetites. Writers for centuries afterward referenced Messalina when they wanted to evoke images of lust or immoral ambition, or the corruption that absolute power could produce. Her name became more than just an insult. It entered common usage as a synonym for a certain type of corruption and excess. Calling someone a Messalina in the centuries after her death meant they were promiscuous, power, hungry, cruel, lacking all moral restraint. The name appeared in literature across languages and cultures. Even today, 2,000 years after her death, Messalina remains recognizable to educated people as representing the ultimate example of power corrupted through unrestrained appetites and ambition. Now, as we come finally to the end of this long story, we need to ask ourselves, what should we make of Messalina? How do we understand her life and her behavior across 2 millennia of distance? What lessons should we draw from her spectacular rise and her even more spectacular fall? First, we need to continue acknowledging the limitations of our sources and the biases they contain. Ancient historians were all men, writing for predominantly male audiences, operating within cultural frameworks that were deeply misogynistic by modern standards. They expected women to be modest, chaste, focused entirely on household and family. Women who violated these expectations were portrayed in the worst possible light, their behavior described in ways that emphasized their deviation from proper feminine norms. Accusations of inappropriate intimate behavior were standard tools for discrediting powerful women, used even when those accusations had little basis in fact or were substantially exaggerated. So, we should maintain appropriate skepticism of the most extreme claims about Messalina that appear in our sources. The specific numbers of her paramours were probably exaggerated for rhetorical effect. The visits to the house in the Suburra described by Juvenal were probably invented or heavily embellished by a satirist looking for the most shocking possible image. Some of the stories about her cruelty may have been attributed to her when they were actually the work of Claudius's advisors, or of Claudius himself, acting on their recommendations. The ancient sources had every incentive to make her seem as depraved as possible, both to justify her execution and to make Claudius seem less culpable for the problems of his reign, and less foolish for being deceived by her. But even accounting generously for exaggeration and bias and misogynistic distortion, a disturbing core remains that cannot be dismissed or explained away. Multiple independent sources corroborate that Messalina had numerous relationships, that she used intimate relations as a political weapon, that she orchestrated the deaths of people who threatened her position or who possessed things she wanted. The marriage to Silius actually happened. There were far too many witnesses for it to have been invented, and the consequences were too immediate and serious for it to have been a fabrication. Her reputation for excess was so well established that even sources generally favorable to Claudius acknowledged it and treated it as common knowledge, requiring no special proof. What we're left with is a portrait of someone whose combination of youth, beauty, intelligence, political power, and complete lack of accountability created a perfect storm of transgressive behavior. Messalina discovered at age 19 that she was Empress of Rome, that she had access to nearly unlimited resources, that she could influence an emperor who was desperately insecure and eager to please her. She learned that she could use intimate relations as a tool to control men and destroy enemies. She learned that consequences were for other people, not for her because her position protected her. And she pushed boundaries progressively further over her 7 years as Empress, testing limits, discovering that limits barely existed for someone in her position. Each transgression that went unpunished emboldened the next one. Each successful manipulation made the next manipulation seem easier. Each person she destroyed with impunity made the next destruction seem more justified, or at least more feasible. She spiraled into increasingly extreme behavior, driven by appetites that seemed insatiable, by a psychological need for transgression that became as powerful as any physical desire, by the corruption that absolute power invariably produces when combined with youth and lack of preparation. But we also need to acknowledge clearly that Messalina made choices for which she bears moral responsibility. She was shaped by circumstances, her birth into the imperial family, her arranged marriage to Claudius, her sudden elevation to Empress while still a teenager. These circumstances were beyond her control and certainly influenced her psychology and her options. But she responded to those circumstances by weaponizing intimate relations to destroy people, by orchestrating murders for personal gain, by showing no apparent concern for anyone's welfare but her own. Whatever psychological factors drove her behavior, she was still responsible for the cruelty she inflicted and the lives she destroyed. The ancient historians who recorded Messalina's story were grappling with profound questions about power and human nature. What happens when power is divorced from restraint? When individual appetite is freed from social constraint? When intelligence and ambition are channeled entirely into self-gratification without regard for others? Their answer, embodied in Messalina's story, is that such a person becomes monstrous, perhaps not evil in a simple sense, but so far beyond normal human boundaries that they can no longer function as part of civilized society, so destructive that they must eventually be eliminated to protect others. Messalina's story is ultimately a tragedy, but not a simple one about a good person destroyed by circumstances. It's the tragedy of someone given everything who destroyed herself through inability to recognize any limits. It's the tragedy of a society that could create empresses with enormous power but couldn't instill responsibility or restraint. It's the tragedy of power corrupting not just morally but psychologically, creating compulsions that override judgment until they lead inevitably to catastrophic self-destruction. The lessons from Messalina's life remain powerfully relevant 2,000 years after her death. Absolute power without accountability corrupts absolutely. Intimate relations can be weaponized for political control. Intelligence and charm divorced from empathy or moral restraint can be extraordinarily destructive. And perhaps most importantly, people given unlimited means to pursue their desires without facing consequences will often spiral into increasingly extreme behavior that ultimately destroys them and everyone around them. When that tribune's sword struck Messalina down in the gardens of Lucullus, it ended one of the most extraordinary lives in all of Roman history. The teenage bride who became Empress had transformed herself into myth even while alive, into the embodiment of corruption and excess, into a cautionary tale that has resonated across 2 millennia, and that continues to fascinate and disturb us today. She left behind 2 young children, Britannicus and Octavia, who would bear the taint of their mother's reputation for the rest of their tragically short lives. Britannicus would be poisoned at age 14, almost certainly murdered by Nero to eliminate a potential rival for the throne. Octavia would be forced to marry Nero, treated with contempt and cruelty throughout the marriage, eventually exiled on false charges, and executed at age 22. The children of Messalina inherited not power or privilege, but catastrophe, their lives destroyed by their mother's actions and reputation in ways that demonstrate how the consequences of corruption extend across generations. She left behind a widowed emperor who remarried less than a year after her death, choosing Agrippina the Younger, who would prove even more politically ambitious than Messalina, though less personally scandalous. Agrippina would manipulate Claudius into adopting her son Nero as his heir, then almost certainly poison Claudius to make Nero emperor. So Claudius's attempt to find a less problematic wife after Messalina's execution failed spectacularly, demonstrating that the structural problems of imperial marriage, the concentration of power in the hands of people unprepared to wield it responsibly, could not be solved simply by replacing one empress with another. And Messalina left behind dozens, if not hundreds, of destroyed lives, families ruined by her political machinations, men compromised by her manipulations, women humiliated by her cruelty. The casualties of her 7 years as empress were enormous, each representing a personal tragedy that the historical sources record only briefly, if at all, because ancient historians focused on the powerful rather than on their victims. What do you think about Messalina's story after hearing all of this? Was she primarily a victim of a corrupt system that gave too much power to people, too young to use it responsibly? Or was she an architect of her own destruction who chose cruelty and excess, despite having other options? How much of what the ancient historians tell us should we believe given their biases and their tendency to exaggerate when describing powerful women? Do you think the story about the house in the Suburra is literally true, or does it work better as a metaphor for the corruption that absolute power produces? Drop your comments below, and let me know your thoughts on this most scandalous empress. If you found this deep dive into ancient Rome's darkest scandals fascinating, and want to learn more about the hidden corners of history that most people never encounter in school, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss future videos about the shocking truth behind historical figures and the dark realities of past civilizations. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know Roman history, because I guarantee this story goes deeper and darker than what they learned in their history classes. The ruins of imperial Rome still stand today as tourist destinations visited by millions of people every year who walk the same ground where Messalina schemed and manipulated and destroyed. the Palatine Hill where the palace stood and where she exercised her power, the forum where senators whispered about her scandals and feared becoming her next target, the gardens of Lucullus where she died, now buried under modern Rome, but once the setting for her final hours. These places remember, even if most of the crowds walking through them don't know the full story or understand the depths of what happened there. Valeria Messalina existed. She wielded enormous power for 7 years. She used that power in ways both fascinating and appalling, ways that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. She destroyed lives, orchestrated murders, weaponized intimate relations, corrupted politics, manipulated an emperor, and ultimately destroyed herself through an act of such spectacular audacity that even Romans accustomed to imperial excess found it incomprehensible. Remember her, not as she wanted to be remembered, as Empress and power broker, controlling an empire from behind the throne, but as history has remembered her, as the ultimate cautionary tale about power without restraint, about intelligence divorced from empathy, about beauty weaponized for cruelty, about how even the most privileged and powerful person can spiral into self-destruction when all limits are removed and all accountability disappears. And remember that the patterns she exemplified, the corruption of power, the weaponization of intimate relations for political purposes, the destruction of lives for personal gratification, these patterns did not die with her 2,000 years ago. They appear throughout history in different forms, in different contexts, with different specific details, but the same underlying dynamics of power and corruption. Understanding Messalina helps us recognize those patterns when they appear in our own time, helps us understand how power corrupts and how societies can enable that corruption, helps us see the human cost of systems that give some people unlimited power over others, without accountability or restraint. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and human nature.